I'm hoping there's going to be a little bit of a PowerPoint that's going to be appearing on the screen. Here we go. It's 10 more days till Christmas. I mean, who could believe that? I'm not sure. How many has your Christmas time been busy so far? Busy? The Dobson household, we have, many people know that we have regular mugs during the year, but in December, we have Christmas mugs. My wife has a slight kind of Christmas fetish, I think, and so she just loves a Christmas mug. December, we bring out the Christmas mugs. Actually, then the house starts getting decorated with all kinds of stuff. Of course, Jesus gets a showing. So my brother lives in Peru, married and got kids and grandkid out there. So when I went to visit him, bought a Peruvian little kind of a clay nativity set. So that comes out every Christmas. In fact, every room gets a little bit of a Christmas turnover. So. And a little bit of Christmas baking and one thing and another. And it feels very like Christmas. We do spend a little bit of time, again, with all the business. And again, if you've had the chance to, see nativity plays and Christmas shopping, actually one of the things that we do as a married couple is we try and find a little book each Advent in the build-up to Christmas. And this is the one that Bev bought and been reading, and over breakfast she'll recount some of the content. It's by Amy Orr Ewing, and it's just a fantastic book that looks at the words of Mary. Now, in literature around Jesus' time, the women's voices were silenced, but people didn't record what women had to say because it wasn't worthwhile. But Luke, when he records the life of Jesus, he puts down some of the amazing words that Mary said. And so Amy Orr Ewing each day just looks at one of the little phrases of one of the things that Mary said around as she realized she was going to be the mother of the Messiah. And each day there's just a little space to think and to reflect. And I just find it within all the business and the chaos, I just find that's kind of really, really helpful. So what I thought this morning is we'd just take a little space to reflect. So you may not have done all your Christmas shopping. You may still kind of have plans to make for traveling to see relatives. But we're just for kind of 20 minutes, we're just going to kind of take a breath. And we're going to think, do you know what? In all the excitement of the season, the carol services and the folky Christmas and all the busyness of inviting friends along to church services, what about you? Actually, what does it feel like for you? What does that the birth of Jesus, his incarnation? How do we make sure that there's space for our own souls, our own imaginations, our own spirits, not to miss the moment? To miss the moment of God entering our world. So we're going to think about this little phrase from one of the carols: light and life to all he brings. As we've been looking at this series on Emmanuel, this morning we're going to think about what's it mean at Advent season for God to step into our world to bring light, and how does that light bring life for us? So here's our reading for this morning, and it's from John chapter 1. It says this: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was God in the beginning. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." And in verse 9 says this: "The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which he was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet, to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children not born of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God." Amazing truth, isn't it? The Word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. We've seen his glory. That's the brightness, the light. We've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who comes from the Father, full of grace and truth. And as we think about Advent and about a time when light comes into our world, Jesus himself, he says this. He says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. That's a promise to us, which is why in the Old Testament, this idea of darkness and light was picked up and was echoed again in Matthew chapter 4. It says this, the people living in darkness. I don't know, as we look around the world today, do we think the world's actually in darkness? Actually, maybe we look in our own hearts at times and we think, actually, are we living in darkness? Are people living in darkness? What's happened? They've seen a great light. Those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. An amazing, amazing truth, isn't it? And which is why, again, in Luke it says this, because of the tender mercy of God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven, to shine on those living in darkness and those in the shadow of death, to guide their feet into the path of peace. And I just want to give us a moment to think, what does it really mean for light to shine into our world? What does it mean for light to shine into our world where frequently we can experience darkness? I don't know if you like the dark. Actually, most people don't like the dark. Why do people not like the dark? Well, I suppose dark brings confusion. If you try and walk through a room when it's dark. I know we had the grandchildren staying a few last winter. And I was trying to creep very quietly to the toilet at night, not to disturb and wake them up. And as I was creaking quietly, I kicked my toe against the wall and it bent sideways and broke. I went to the toilet and I fainted with a crash, blood, and woke everyone in the house up. Why? Because darkness, there's confusion. You don't see where you are. There's something about dark that brings fear. I know for some people there's a fear of the dark. Sometimes that's rational. You're not quite sure what's there. Sometimes actually it's irrational. There's a fear of darkness. Sometimes there's uncertainty. You're not quite sure where things are. Actually, maybe there's a lostness. Maybe you've gone for a walk on the hillside and you set out in the afternoon and suddenly it's starting to get dark and as you try to find the footpath down to the car park, again, you're not quite sure of the directions. Maybe darkness brings the sense of lostness. As we look at our world, darkness brings evil. Maybe evil and violence thrive when it's dark and when there's too much alcohol and that's maybe where some of the stuff, and maybe people are fearful for their own safety to go out in the dark at night. If you put a pot plant in the dark for too long, actually it will die. And there's some things around, we're living in darkness. Actually, maybe we feel that, not just in the world round about us, but maybe actually at times we feel that in our own hearts, our own lives. We feel the sense of confusion, sense of fear, uncertainty, lostness. Maybe in our own hearts sometimes, I don't know if you would call it evil, but maybe you know that you live a life that's not genuine and right and true. Maybe there's anger and there's resentment and jealousies and unforgiveness that you know is there, and maybe even a deadness at times, and that's the darkness. That's the darkness that is spoken about here, and that's why in John chapter 3 it says this. It says, "This is the verdict in a world where we can feel the darkness. This is the verdict: light has come into the world. Hooray! But people love darkness instead of the light because their deeds were evil." I mean, how can anybody prefer darkness to light? Well, it's because they don't want to be found out. They don't want to change. They don't want to be unsettled. Actually, maybe they feel it's safer to stay in the dark rather than if the light was truly to show what was real about you and about your thoughts. Actually, maybe it says everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light. Why? For fear that their deeds will be exposed. And that's a fascinating thought, isn't it, in our world? Paul at the beginning of Romans just tries to explain, again, something of the darkness that's taken over the world that God created to be a beautiful, warm, loving place. That was always his intention, but somehow darkness has come into our world. And it says this, although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. And this is what changed. But in their thinking, they became futile. And their foolish hearts, what happened? They were darkened. The light went out. The light went out in their hearts. Why? Because their thinking became futile. Although they claimed to be wise, actually they became fools, because Paul goes on to explain they started to worship created things rather than the Creator who's ever blessed. And actually when we open up our minds and our hearts to the created stuff rather than the Creator, what happens is a darkness takes over our own hearts, our own imaginations. Actually, a darkness takes over a neighborhood, a community, a city, a country, a world. That's what happens when people start to worship created things rather than the Creator. And in the darkness of those choices, actually we can find ourselves in a materialistic world where Christmas is all about, actually if you want to be happy, you just get more stuff. And there's the John Lewis adverts and all the kind of all the Christmassy kind of jingly-jangly stuff. And get this and you'll get happy. Maybe just for one day in the year. But actually there's a darkness that comes just from living from physical stuff, worshipping the created stuff rather than the Creator who's forever blessed. So as we think about Advent, and we think about Christmas, and we think about the state in which not only our world, but our own hearts have got into, we've become darkened. Actually, we need light to bring revelation. And that's the next thing. We need, and that's why when it talks about light here, light shows things up. Light brings revelation. In fact, this is what it says in Luke chapter 2. For my eyes have seen your salvation. This is when Simeon was holding Jesus. My eyes have seen your salvation, which you prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of his people Israel. Actually, there's something that for those who are not God's people, who are not Israel, actually, there's going to be a revelation. The light's going to go on. Ping! Something's going to be shone into your heart and life. You're going to find out what is true and what is right. Actually, what is the biggest thing? What is the darkest thing that's out there? Actually, I think the darkest thing is that people don't know God. I mean, that's the root cause of everything that goes wrong. People don't know God. Actually, even if they kind of think about God, they might call God, it's the universe, or it's kind of or some kind of force. But actually, we need revelation that actually, who exactly is God? John chapter 12, Jesus says this. Actually, in the darkness of people being confused, is God harsh? Is he judgmental? Is he picking on me? Does he not love me as much as he loves them? Actually, how do we understand the character and nature of God? How do we find that revelation? Well, the light needs to go on. Jesus says this. Then Jesus cried out, John chapter 12, whoever believes in me does not believe in me only, but in the one who sent me. These amazing words. The one who looks at me is seeing the one who sent me. I have come into the world as a light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness. Actually, God doesn't want you to stay in the darkness of your knowledge of who he is. Actually, he wants to be known. He doesn't want to be thought of as just some kind of big force out there, impersonal, impassive. Actually, he wants to be known. He wants the light to go on. He wants that to be revealed to you. Actually, he wants you to know and understand what he's like. Which for me is why that's the amazing thing about this time of the year. Is that question that we're living in darkness, the enemy that tries to blind us, to convince us that either there isn't a God or that he's harsh and mean and vindictive and judgmental and violent. God has stepped into our world to show this is what I'm like. 2 Corinthians says this. Chapter 4, for God who said, let light shine out of darkness, Genesis, made his light shine where? In our hearts, to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory. Where do we see it? Displayed in the face of Christ. We see God's glory displayed in the face of Jesus. And as we remember that first Christmas time, that God becoming a human being. Paul says in Colossians 1, verse 15, actually he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Actually, how do we understand in the darkness of our thinking of all the things that happen in this world that can say that God's uncaring, he's unloving? How do we understand what he's like? Well, God in 3 dimensions. Here he is now in Jesus. The invisible becomes visible. And now God was pleased that to have all his fullness dwell in Jesus. Jesus wasn't just a good man. He wasn't just a good moral teacher. He wasn't just a good human being. Actually, he was God, the fullness of God dwelling in him. That's a great Advent thought. We could just spend the rest of the service just thinking about that. God stepping into our world. The fullness of who God is, there in a baby in a manger. The writer of the Hebrews says this, that the Son, again, this idea of light, the Son is the radiance, the shining. He's the radiance proceeding from God. He's the radiance of God's glory. That word glory, again, has got connotations of light, glowing, shining. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. I mean, that question that we live in darkness, what's God like? We look at Jesus. And when we look at Jesus, he is the Word made flesh. We've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only. That question, a world living in darkness, what is God like? As we see Jesus in human form, we know what God is like. As we see Jesus, we know his compassion, his love, his tenderness. We see something about the way he reached out to the marginalized and to the oppressed, how he releases healing, both physical and emotional and spiritual, to people who are held in darkness. We see him standing up against the religious powers that are oppressing, and he stands up for what's true and what's just. We see him standing up again against those powers as he goes to the cross, and even as he gives his physical life and dies on the cross, his words are, Father, forgive them. Forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. One of the cruelest moments in history. What is God like? He's forgiving. He's gracious. He's caring. He's merciful. This Advent time, do we give chance to think? This question that shines into the darkness of our imaginations, the darkness of our doubts and our thoughts about God. We know what God is like because he became one of us. So the second thing I think is actually Advent time, we know what God's like. But actually the most amazing thing in the incarnation, Jesus becoming human, actually God, he learns something too. We don't just learn something about God, but God learns something about us. Actually, God knows what we're like. He discovers for the first time what it feels like to be human. I mean, the truth is that he created us. So in some ways, he knows about us. He knows about how he made us and how we work and how we operate, and knows about our emotions, about our physical well-being. He knows about the resources of this world. Actually, he knows about us. But until he became a human being, he didn't know what it was like to be us. He didn't know what it was like to be you. To live the life that you're living in the human body that you've got, with your human thoughts and your human emotions and the feelings of love and peace and rejection and cruelty. Actually, he didn't know what it felt like to be human until he entered Mary's womb. And the Creator was dependent on the creation. As there, hidden in Mary's womb, God himself was dependent on the blood and the oxygen that Mary gave to him. What a wonder. As he was born, we see that not only that, actually, he was dependent on Mary for life. Actually, he wouldn't have survived. God wouldn't have survived in this world as a human being without Mary. Without Mary feeding, the very milk that Mary gave, the creation sustained the Creator. I mean, that is just mind-blowing. We know, actually, Jesus had to learn as a human being. He had to learn. He learned how to control his bladder. He had to learn how to control his bowels. He had to learn how to feed himself. Actually, Jesus had the same experiences that you had. Jesus would have had to have learned how to walk. Just because he was God, he didn't pop out of the womb knowing how to do everything. Actually, he had the very human experiences that you have. He had to learn how to eat and to feed and to walk. Actually, amazingly, Luke records this about Jesus, that as a child, when he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them, actually Jesus, God himself, who is the one who should be always obeyed, actually he learned what it was to be obedient to his mum and dad. Jesus, come in for tea. Stop playing with your friends. He had to learn how. The God who made everything learned how to be obedient to the creation. Actually, he learned to be a carpenter. I don't know. Do you think Jesus? Again, sometimes we kind of had this idea of Jesus being so godly that, but actually, as human beings, we probably learn by making mistakes. And I wonder whether Jesus learned by making mistakes. I don't think he just was a brilliant carpenter because he was God. I think he was a carpenter that maybe he did hit his thumb with a hammer from time to time. Maybe those dovetailed joints weren't brilliant from the start because he shared humanity like us. He had to learn how to do things like we learn to do things. He learned about human friendship, about loyalty, about humour. He learned what it is to connect with people, to observe joy and observe pain. And actually, as a human being, God experienced what it is to be like you and like me. Actually, the reality is the God who could have stayed in heaven where everything was blissful, he chose to become a human being. Why? Because he entered into our broken world. He entered into our world where there is pain, where there's cruelty, where people treat you unjustly, where things happen to you that you didn't deserve, where people who you thought were your friends betray you. He lived in a world where he saw and observed the pain of friends who are dying, and just again the mourning and the hopelessness before Jesus' death and resurrection, when our eternal life is secured, actually living and just seeing people gathered around a grave with that hopelessness of what is going to happen now. The wonder of this season isn't to do with holly and tinsel and Christmas pudding. Actually, this wonder of this season is that God, who is God, he knows you. He understands you. He knows what it is to feel what you feel, to think what you think, to react to situations, how you react. And yet, it says this in Hebrews chapter 4. For we don't have a high priest who is unable to feel sympathy for our weakness. Actually, God can truly do that now. He couldn't do that before the incarnation. He couldn't do that before Jesus came. He couldn't feel sympathy for our weakness. It would have just been an abstract thought. But because he lived in our world, he now knows. He's not one who's unable to feel sympathy for our weakness, but but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet did not sin. And that is Jesus that we follow. That's the story. Far better than Elf or Father Christmas, or actually it's a story that is one that brings light to the darkness of our world. It brings light to the darkness of our thinking, when we can feel nobody understands, nobody knows, nobody can feel what I feel in the bleakness and the darkness of things that happened this year, or maybe you're heading to Christmas for the first time and a loved one's not going to be there with you, and the pain and disappointment. You think, how can God understand that? Well, the way he can understand that is that he's been there. That first Christmas, God steps into our world, feels what we feel, and yet found there was a different kind of light. There was a light that shone into the darkness. The darkness couldn't overcome him, but he overcame the darkness. And that's the kind of resilient life that we can open our hearts to, even this morning. as we take a chance to worship in a moment, maybe take a chance to come and receive some prayer. If you're living under the shadow of darkness, if you're living where somehow you feel that darkness has come into the inside of you, whether your thoughts, the futility, as Paul says, the futility of your thoughts and darkness of your heart. Actually, the truth is that this morning, Jesus is the light of the world. He can shine into your hearts, into your doubts, into your fears, and brings a light that's life. Life as he always intended. Light and life to all he brings. So those are the two things that I think for this morning, that for us to meditate on, to think about. Actually, we know what God is like. In all the confusion and the darkness and people's thinking about God, this force, the universe, the kind of whatever it is, actually we know who God is because of Jesus. And God knows us because of Jesus, knows how we feel. So this is the prayer that Paul prays, and in some ways it's my prayer for you this morning, is that he says this: I keep asking that God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the glorious Father, may give you the spirit of wisdom and revelation. The light goes on. The light goes on in your thinking, so that you may, what? You might know him better. How can we know God better? In the face of Jesus. All our misgivings, all our misthinkings about God, actually we can know him better. Why? Because of Jesus. I pray that the eyes of your hearts will be enlightened, in order that you may know the hope to which he's called you, the riches of his glorious inheritance in his holy people, and his incomparable great power for us who believe. What a story. It's our story. To those who believed, to those who received and gave the power to become children of God. And that's the offer. That's the offer this morning to us. And I wonder whether we could just take a moment or two of quiet. Again, in all the business and preparations and things that we're going to, Christmas party, office parties, actually, let's take just a moment for the truth, the profound truth. We know who God is because of Jesus. God knows what we're like because of Jesus. Let's take a moment. Lord, we just take these moments of quiet, and again, we want the light to go on in our imaginations. We want the light to go on in our emotions. We want the light to go on in our spirit. Lord, we say that we can live in the darkness, in the shadow of darkness, and we know that we need light. We need light when our thinking is futile. We need light when our hearts are darkened. Thank you, Jesus, that you came as the light of the world. I think the appropriate response is worship, it's adoration. It's why those shepherds came to worship. It's why those wise men brought their gifts. It's why the angels sang out. It's adoration. Lord, in these moments, we just take a moment to adore you. To reflect on who you are, what you do. If you know there's darkness holding your thoughts or your emotions, even just as we worship now, maybe ask God to turn the light on, to bring the light of his presence to you, to bring healing, to bring peace rather than fear and anxiety. Maybe as you might even like someone to pray with you, and there's going to be some people over on the side here, and while we're worshiping, if you'd like, even like someone to pray that you know the light of God this season, maybe you come to know Jesus for the very first time, then why don't you come and get some prayer? But let's stand together. And as we stand, we're going to worship, and we're going to use these songs to adore Jesus together. But if you like, maybe you just want to open your hearts to the light of Jesus as we worship. But if you'd like someone to pray with you, the prayer team will be down the side here, and we'd just love to pray for you. But let's worship Jesus together.